Welcome to Talking Insights, the podcast series from Esomar that gazes into the crystal ball of the future to find out where the world is going next. I'm your host, Shrikar Govindaraju, and throughout this series, I'm speaking to researchers and thought leaders from around the world to explore the past, present, and future of technology, society, business, and beyond. There's no time like the present to talk about the future, so let's dive in. Technology is evolving fast, and nowhere is this more evident than in China. Although Western media coverage of China and technology tends to focus on the government, a new wave of Chinese companies and startups are driving the development of pivotal new tools such as blockchain, cryptocurrency, and fintech. As the rest of the world starts to play catch-up to China, what insights can we gain from their fast-growing market that can help developers elsewhere? How are the Chinese public utilizing technology in their day-to-day lives? And how is China driving its national development through technology? Well, joining me today to provide a boots-on-the-ground view from China is Eliza Gkritsi, community listening reporter for Technode based in Shanghai, and she specializes in reporting on blockchain, crypto, and China's fintech sector. She's previously worked as a reporter for Wiki Tribune and Athens Live, and holds a double MSc in Global Media and Communications from the London School of Economics and Fudan University, as well as a BA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from the University of York. And I can add from personal experience that she makes a damn good tzatziki. So Eliza, thank you very much for joining me on Talking Insights.
Hey, Shrikar, really good to be on with you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I think we've got plenty to talk about in this episode. Let's start with, so blockchain, crypto, and fintech we mentioned as a kind of three main areas that you're interested in and focused on in your work. Blockchain in particular, I've done some research on it, but not everyone is very familiar with it. So can you give us a kind of quick Cliff Notes version of how it actually works?
Yeah, so blockchain is basically a different way of storing information, and it's somewhat decentralized to different extents, but it's basically a chain of blocks that record the information, and it uses encryption and cryptography to improve data security and transparency. So it's not a magic solution to anything, and it's not necessarily tied to cryptocurrencies, although it's the ledger that cryptocurrencies are built on. But yeah, it has a lot of applications, like anything from cryptocurrencies, like how does a bank keep track of your money, to you as a company, how do you keep track of all your employees and where they're traveling this month, right? So it's a multi-purpose key, I would say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I remember reading, sometime when I was doing my own master thesis looking at blockchain, the original white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, and that's kind of the pseudonym, which is like the underpinning for Bitcoin and everything that came afterwards. But as you mentioned, there are more modern uses for companies of things that I've come across are, keeping track of shipping ledgers, when you're transporting goods by sea. I think banks or, keeping track of ID documents for human rights refugees. And what are some of the uses of blockchain that you're seeing emerging in China that's perhaps more day-to-day or, used even by the government as well?
So one big area is supply chain traceability with a particular focus on food. So, for example, Walmart and IBM have worked on a traceability platform where you can scan a code on your food, and then you can see where it came from and what factory did it come from and who transported it, and so on and so forth. A lot of like cross-border trade things going on recently, and a lot of enterprise applications. So as I was saying, like keeping track of your employees, you can also just use it from a very boring and unsexy perspective of changing your databases in a way that allows like different departments to have access to all this data, and this data to be easily transferable and more transparently kept and more securely kept. With regards to government applications, there's a really big push from various governments around China. The biggest one, the most comprehensive plan I've seen would be from the local government of Beijing, so not the central government, the city government.
Yeah.
And they have like a list of 12 areas where they want to use blockchain, and a lot of it is for customs and cross-border transactions and trade, but also like what they call e-governance. So marriage certificates. So you put your marriage certificate on the blockchain, and then that's more easy to find for other people. What else? A lot of like financial applications, real estate, so keeping track of who owns what.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean they are now in the process of, I think, rolling it out to pretty much every aspect of government that you can imagine.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, looking at China in that this kind of discussion around blockchain being used for, land registries. It's something that has been in the discussion. It's been in the space for a while, but I don't think any countries have really taken that step of pushing forward and doing it. And you think perhaps is that's what sets China apart right now? Is it's not just a discussion around, oh, let's think about doing this, but there's a real drive to actually get it implemented and get it, in daily use.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, since Satoshi's paper and the advent of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin becoming like worth $20,000 or whatever it is, right? There's been a
Yeah.
lot of talk about the magic of blockchain and that we can do everything, but not so much implementation. Although I would say that around the world it has entered the mainstream in the last year. But I think China is really, really good at rolling out technology, and it's really good at experimenting with technology. And I think that's something that's not very well understood outside China.
Mm-hmm.
So, what the central government does is they say, oh, we want to develop this technology, in this case, blockchain. So, last year, Xi Jinping made a speech in October, end of October, so almost 1 year from today. Um, and he said, we want to develop blockchain. And so all the local governments hear this and they want their city or their province to be the best. They want their province to be the best blockchain developer in the eyes of the central government because the officials
Yeah.
themselves want to, get kudos for their work. And so they start racing at this and they think, okay, what can we do? What can we do? So we can make a technology park and we can give incentives like tax breaks and free rent and free offices to companies. We can make blockchain companies. We can make, what else do they do? We can make like training academies. We can partner with innovative companies to build training centers for engineers. We can tell our universities to set up blockchain labs. So they think of all these different ways to develop this technology. And then they pick a lot of different companies and they sort of court them to convince them that you want to work
Mm-hmm.
with us, right? You want to work with the Shanghai government to do this. Or it's actually like even more micro than that. So I know that in Shanghai, there's like 3 different district governments. So this would be like the equivalent of like Hackney versus the City of London versus
Yeah.
Islington, that are courting like different experts and companies to become part of their like blockchain development programs. And so then you have all these local governments partnering with private companies and throwing a lot of money in, which of course creates a lot of growth and a lot of buzz and a lot of random products and a lot of applications in government services or I don't know, like the metro. Um, and a lot of that is going to end up being a total waste of money because,
Mm-hmm.
maybe those people don't really know what they're doing, but some of them will end up being great. And then someone at the higher levels of the government is maybe going to see that and they're going to start to take it nationwide. Or it might not even have to do with like the government at all. Maybe the company that worked with this district government to make this real estate registry thing, then it becomes so successful that they get other clients and they get more clients and their company grows organically through market forces. So this is really how um, tech. This is a very like high level view of how tech becomes popular, and you can see that with all sorts of things like agricultural technology. I'm a really big fan of, and a lot of the western provinces of China or rural China, the local governments want to draw companies to revitalize rural areas. So they're doing the same
Yeah.
thing with like drones or IoT for agriculture. So yeah, it's really fascinating and it moves really fast. And it's very also it's very hard to know which one of these things are going to be successful. And it's like a situation where there's so many people trying to sell you on their idea all the time.
I mean, just the description you gave then, we were, just before we started recording and we were having a little kind of pre-discussion, and you mentioned sometimes, moving from Europe to then living in China, it's almost like being in a parallel universe. And the way you describe things then, to me, being based in Europe, you think this is all the things that we kind of talk about here as being, the distant Blade Runner future, but is a reality, and it's every day right now already in China. And I think, as you mentioned, then a lot of that has to do with the government push for this to become a reality, as opposed to relying on private industry to try and get things to that point. Do you think that's kind of the distinction here, that perhaps in the Western world we're too reliant on private enterprises, whether it's venture capitalists or whoever else, pushing the kind of innovation or pushing the investment, as opposed to it being government driven?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the government definitely has a really big influence here, and one real advantage that the regulators and the policymakers here have is that they can really work for the long term, right? So they have 5-year plans. The new one is going to come out in the next couple of months. And the 5-year plans build onto one another, but they have a vision even longer than that, right? So when they say
Yeah.
we're investing in blockchain as the government, it's not because they want some people to vote for them in the next election. They are thinking very, very long term. So I think that's one big advantage. They're in it for the long game, which I think, coming from Europe is very shocking.
It's not really a reality that we're used to here, is it? It's more of a every few years everything gets flipped on its head and new priorities come in and all the rest.
But I also I would say that Chinese entrepreneurs are crazy, quite frankly. Like the work ethic is absolutely insane to me.
So it's in a good kind of way.
It's no, and I mean some of them are actually crazy, but they make it work. But so things that other countries consider bad. So for example, there's no protection of copyright, right? That actually increases competition to such an insane extent, because if you made Amazon and you trademark your whatever, your algorithm and your platform and your logo, and then you're protected, then that's one level of competition. If you make Amazon and as soon as it becomes popular, literally 5,000 other companies just steal your code, and they just throw more money at making it work, then the competition is just insane. And also it's also the size of China. Once you have a product working in China, you're talking 1.4 billion people, which is not it's more than the combined population of Europe and the US. So
I guess again on that competition front, it could perhaps be, if you're big in one city in China, that's perhaps the equivalent of being huge in an entire country over in Europe, right? Or being successful on a national level in Europe. So it's more, there's that room for competition and innovation, which perhaps we just don't have in the West. Or it's fascinating to kind of wrap your head around, because you mentioned then you might have thousands of copycat companies, but then how do you get that one? You take something like your Alibabas or Tencents of China. How do you get that one which really stands out and really kind of rises above this sea of competition?
I mean, I don't think there's one recipe for that. I think after a certain level, there is a certain friendliness and blurring of the lines between private and public sector that doesn't really happen in the West. But it's if you're an entrepreneur and it looks like you're really great at building telecommunications infrastructure, I'm not implying anyone in particular.
Yeah.
Then you might attract the attention of some people that will help you, but they will also push you, right? I think the Chinese system is very meritocratic in some ways, but in other ways it's not. So anyway, I mean that's I think that's going into areas that I'm not an expert on.
No, it's interesting to think about, because what you mentioned then in terms of there's a kind of that that bond that emerges between a private body and the public body. I kind of think, look at Amazon's corporate tax rate in Europe, or you look at, Facebook's kind of sweetheart deal with Ireland, and you think we do have a very similar approach here. But the thing is, at the end of the day, that the advantages that China seems to get from these relationships don't really manifest themselves in Europe. It's more of there's a lot of taking by the companies and then not much giving in return.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess that does have to do with the size of the companies, because, Google is bigger than Greece, which is where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in China, you don't really have this, like China, like the Chinese government will be like bigger and more powerful than a lot of these companies. But I think they're just better at working together as well, the private and the public. But yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, that's a good segue point, actually, because this integrating the private and public. Speaking of blockchain, and obviously one of the main applications of blockchain, I got sidetracked a bit there, is cryptocurrency. And crypto, you mentioned, is one of your kind of specialist or your interest areas. I'm curious, what is the perception of cryptocurrency in China versus here in the West? Whereas there's been a lot of, I would hesitate to say fear mongering, but it is in that vein of, cryptocurrency is what you use to buy drugs or hire hitmen on the dark web. And, you have people like the CEO of JP Morgan calling it out as a scam or some kind of Ponzi scheme. How is cryptocurrency viewed in China when here in the West it's torn between a very niche hobby or as like an investment, or it's seen as just outright fraudulent?
So I'm gonna whatever I'm gonna say applies to like urbanites, not so much people in rural China who probably don't even know what crypto is.
Yeah.
Because there's a big divide there. So crypto is quite like a touchy topic in China, and especially in the sense that it's considered a scam. There's still a lot of scams related to cryptocurrency in China, and actually everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And the government has still banished the major Chinese exchanges like Binance back in 2017. Of course, people have like VPNs and they can still access it. So yeah, I think I wouldn't say it's really mainstream at all. And I think that is in part because the government didn't really like let it become mainstream. But at the same time, I think if you gave someone a crypto wallet in China, they'll probably understand it or like be more willing to use it. Just interfacing with the application, because we are a lot more used to Alipay and WeChat and that kind of thing. And then there is, of course, a crypto community, which is extremely vibrant. And some of the world's most important cryptocurrency companies are based in China or are Chinese, but technically like headquartered in other places.
Yeah. I saw, I think it was one of your articles actually on Technode talking about Ethereum and, their kind of push into China. And they were talking a lot about how there's a lot of talent there in terms of the developers and the community too, who can find it fascinating that at the same time there's this skeptical attitude from the government, but there's so much talent that's ready in China and interested in working on this technology. And how do you see perhaps that developing as you move forwards? Do you think China might perhaps become more open to the idea of cryptocurrency?
No.
No. Simple answer.
I think so. Like so China does not allow initial coin offerings, for example. Actually, I was just writing yesterday about OKEX, which is a crypto exchange, and it's the rumor is going around right now that they did a backdoor listing in Hong Kong in 2018, and there's a rumor. I mean, definitely, their co-founder is being investigated and has been arrested.
Okay.
That's definitely true, but
yeah,
nobody really knows why. And the rumor is that it's because of this backdoor listing. So like the Chinese government I don't think is ever gonna like ICOs.
Hmm.
And quite frankly, I agree with them. Because I think that ICOs is just like a crazy thing that's happening. I think like it's on paper, it's a good idea to use tokenization and offering like a coin to help your business. But in practice, what you do is you create this huge stock market with no regulation.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of instances of people issuing coins and then they just sell off the owners of the company or the parts of the foundation, like they will sell off all of their coins as soon as the price is picked up, and then the coin
Yeah.
dumps, and you know what this happens.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm shaking my head.
Well, because it makes you think of, I'm kind of thinking back to when I was doing company law back at university, and obviously there's all these laws around when you have a share offering, for example, in a conventional company, and what type of shares you can issue, how you can issue them, how they can be transferred, and tokenization just seems to be a way to sidestep all of that, to raise capital without any real oversight, and that leads to, as you mentioned, these instances where as soon as the value goes up, people sell and run. And then that in turn feeds into this perception of cryptocurrency as being, shady, for lack of a better word, or untrustworthy.
Yeah, and I like, sometimes when I explain this to people, they're like, "How is this legal?" And I think that's a fair question.
Hmm.
But and I think in China, like on this topic of like regulating crypto, one of the big debates going on recently from a lot of investors are really not happy with centralized exchanges. So, now like the rise of DeFi, which I don't really understand very well myself. Um, but a lot of investors are not happy, and they think that the exchanges like OKX or Binance, because they themselves might be trading, they say they issue a lot of fake tokens,
Hmm.
that don't there's no like company behind them, just because they want to make money, and they say they are artificially messing with the prices of the tokens because they are not regulated.
Yeah. And and it also makes you think of, here in, if you go back to the Bitcoin example, because Bitcoin is, it's the most well known of all the cryptocurrencies. And you mentioned previously how, the value kind of, there was that amazing spike when it hit 20 odd something $1,000. And a lot of that was driven not necessarily by people who were trying to embrace that disruptive model that Nakamoto first put forward, of being, here's an alternative way of thinking about currency that relies more on trust as opposed to these gatekeepers. But then it was transformed into something that's viewed more as a commodity for investors and venture capitalists to get into. Which of those perspectives do you think is more prevalent, perhaps in China? Is it seen at the moment crypto as this? It's another form of an asset, or it's another kind of commodity to invest in, or is there still more that spirit that, hey, here's something really disruptive that really changes the way that we deal with finance and we deal with banks and these institutions?
That's a good question. Um, So I think mainly the people who trade on it as an asset. I feel like, now
Mm-hmm.
it's I'm not sure what the price is today, but it's within the $10,000, right? So I don't think a coin worth $10,000 can necessarily like disrupt anymore. And I think the technology has moved past Bitcoin itself, and we see that other methods like staking are perhaps better ways, because the Bitcoin
Mm.
network, you just can't basically like do transactions because it just takes too long. Um,
Yeah.
but I would say that I think the whole blockchain industry, not just the crypto people, has definitely moved away from Satoshi's vision. And if we're seeing Costco and Alibaba use blockchain for their shipping logistics,
Yeah.
um, then I think a lot of big companies, not just technology companies, have realized that there is a different potential to blockchain that is perhaps completely antithetical to
Hmm.
the original like crypto anarchist vision.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the big companies, recently, just to bring it back to Europe for a second, here in the Netherlands, we had a news story about how there's been a huge new wind farm that's opened, and it can generate enough power to supply 300,000 households. But then it was later revealed that the power would be going to a Microsoft data center that's going to be built in the area, and not for the Azure kind of cloud service, not actually for the Netherlands, it's to service users in the Middle East and in Africa as well. And I think energy is a big part of this conversation, which a lot of people might not think about or focus about, because as you well know, when you're using a blockchain, you're using cryptocurrency, mining, actually kind of achieving that cryptographic truth and proof of I've forgotten the term here, but yeah, the proof of kind of solution that you have to do.
Proof of work.
Proof of work. There we go. It takes a huge amount of energy and GPU usage. How big is this in China, really? Because if you mention the interest that there is, how much mining is actually going on in China, and on an environmental level or an energy level, what is the impact? Because it must be pretty huge.
So this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I love talking about mining in China. So I
but not the kind of mining people might normally think about.
This is crypto mining, which is it also creates a lot of confusion, because there's crypto miners, but then there's Bitcoin farms. So the metaphors there get confused. So I don't know what the actual percentage of the total electricity is, because a lot of the mining is not totally legal, not totally illegal. There was a point in the early Bitcoin days where I think entrepreneurs, and not like a regular student-time entrepreneur, but people with entrepreneurial spirit in China realized how big mining is going to be. And then you had these huge infrastructure projects that the Chinese government loves to do, of hydropower, solar power, in parts of China that there's just not so much electricity usage. So, and I think they were the first to really understand the importance of scale in mining, because the more, put very simply, the more machines you have, the more likely you are to do the right, to win the lottery, let's say, because it is kind of like winning the lottery, because your computer is guessing. Anyway, and so it's gotten to the point where China accounts for, depending who you ask, 50 to 60% of the global hash rate for Bitcoin, which is a measure of the computing power of the network. And it's crazy, because it really is it really was people just sort of finding the right dam operator and plugging in their Bitcoin machines. And that has become very professionalized. Now the latest mining machines cost 20,000 each, and you need a lot of them to run a sustainable business. So out in the mountains, in the Himalayas, in the middle of nowhere, and the plains of Mongolia, you have these mining farms, and this is where the Bitcoin network happens. And so they're using so much electricity, it's going to be quite a lot. And it's also seasonal, which I find really interesting. So when it's rain season in Sichuan, which is in sort of southwest China next to the Himalayas, and then the rain falls from the Himalayas down into the dams, and there's a lot of electricity production. So then that accounts for more of the hash rate, and then it might move to Xinjiang when there's more sun. Which is, I think, I think it's just
it's weird, so weirdly sustainable in a way, right? If it's kind of seasonal and it's using these renewable sources, if you're talking about hydroelectric power or solar power, I mean, how does the sustainability factor play into this? Because surely, as with the rest of the world, China must also be looking at things like carbon footprint and how to boost that renewable energy rate.
Yeah, so now they made the thing is, some of it is coal, I must say. I think in Mongolia, they have really cheap coal electricity. Also note these places are cold, which also helps keep the machines cool. So it keeps your
Yeah.
cooling costs down, and you're consuming less electricity for that. So it's sustainable power, but it's not being used for something that you might want your huge infrastructure project to be used for. Maybe you were thinking, oh, this can power homes, or cars.
Yeah.
Something that is perhaps more useful to the people of China. So now they set the new carbon goals for 2030 and 2060, and this was just like a speech, so there's nothing really concrete that has come out of it. But I'm really curious to see how that impacts Bitcoin and other miners, other kinds of miners in China, because I really don't know, because I don't know if governments think of this as, oh, this is a great use of our electricity, or if they think it's a waste,
Well, let's say if we draw a parallel perhaps between that kind of data center use case in the Netherlands and, in China as well. I mean, do you have a similar situation developing in China with, data centers in particular now taking up more of not just the electricity, but kind of land usage? And is there requirements in China, as there are, we've seen in India with their new data protection law, to have, servers built in India if they're going to use the data of Indian citizens? Is there a similar approach in China where the, companies that are international are having to build data centers in China to serve the needs of the local population?
Yes. The China started sort of having piecemeal regulation about this around 2006, and then it kept going until 2017, where they released their landmark cybersecurity law. That's how I write it in my articles. And there they have very strict data localization requirements. As a result, so I use an iPhone. My iCloud data is stored in a company, Guizhou, which is also near the Himalayas. They have these big caves, and so Apple has had joint venture with a local company, and they've built some data centers in the caves. Also, by the way, a lot of these mining companies call themselves data centers.
Okay.
And there was, in Sichuan, which is near the Himalayas with the big hydropower dams, there was a new policy to sort of bring companies in, and they want to make hydropower parks. So create a tech park next to the dam, so that there's no wasted electricity. And everyone was looking out if there was going to be some mining companies which call themselves data center operators, and there were some. So that's kind of good signs from at least that particular province that they are looking at mining as an industry worth supporting. But yeah, China data localization a lot, so much. It's a very pretty strict framework. They say that any data related to national security, they have this category called critical infrastructure operators, which includes finance, transport infrastructure, military infrastructure, and then also they consider critical data any data that has to do with more than 500,000 people. And all of that, you're not really supposed to move outside China. Now, what's really interesting is that whilst India and Indonesia and Nigeria and other countries, and the EU with Schrems too, whilst all these countries are moving towards data localization, China very recently wants to move away from it. So they're not exactly. So they're experimenting with in the free trade zones. So in Hainan, Shanghai, maybe Beijing, but we don't know. But definitely in Hainan and Shanghai, the free trade zone plans include provisions of, we're going to make it easier for companies to move their data abroad to presumably enable cross-border trade of data. And also in their latest data security law, they said that maybe local governments can have a little bit more responsibility to judge each company's like data flow. So if I'm a company in Shanghai and I tell the government that I want to move my data on transport to the UK bus maker because I want them to TFL, right? Because I want them to help me like build a system of creating bus lines or whatever. Then the Shanghai government would have like more freedom to decide that without going to the Ministry of Information Security. And there's like 11 ministries involved in approving cross-border data flows.
So it's got a healthy layer of bureaucracy just to make sure that no one is abusing the system.
Yeah. I mean, so on the draft security law was really interesting because, China had a very strict data policy for national security, starting in 2017 and even before that. And they were very clear that, data is an important resource that we need to keep in our country because we want to have a sort of competitive advantage. And now they're moving more. I think again, I don't really know what like is going on in the minds of the people that make these policy documents. But the way I see it, and other analysts have seen it, is that they see it more like oil, and so they want to create a good framework of how do you trade that, and how do you also they include provisions that say if a country doesn't share their data with us, so the EU, which will presumably not share data with China because they don't have good privacy protection, so under like GDPR adequacy provisions, they can't share data. Then China is like, oh, so we're not going to share our data with you either.
Well, the dangers in new oil conversation is super interesting. I think we could do a whole separate discussion just on that. But one of the things that has been striking to me with the way you're describing things in China is that all the conversations that are now happening in Europe seem to have happened in China about 5 years ago, and they've been moved on first. It's things that are still in the discussion space here or a very kind of early stage they're already implemented on a day to day, or they're being innovated further upon in China. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me, we've had a couple of conversations about this since lockdown began as well, is in the fintech space. And fintech space, online banking in particular, generally people doing more things online. There's the scale of it in China is amazing compared to the stage we're at in Europe. Why do you think the general public or customers in China have been so much more receptive and have been so quick to take on things like fintech and online only services than people based in Europe and in the US?
So I think a lot of that has to do with online to offline integration from the design perspective. So when Alipay and WeChat popularize their solutions, you have this QR code. And so now, like literally, even beggars in China, which there are not many beggars in China, let me be clear about that. But even they will have a printed QR code where you can scan it with your phone, with your WeChat or your Alipay, and you can send money to them. And everything, like whenever I go back to Europe, I just feel like I've traveled back in time, honestly. Other things, not so much. I think a lot of this was because China did at the time have a really, really strict financial system. So like, and it still is really strict. And even for Alipay and WeChat, like they do have to abide by pretty strict regulations. But the financial system was very controlled, and so I think it was a very easy solution to people. And Alipay and WeChat did a very, very good job of this online to offline integration, which I think is very important. There's no cards. I just explained to a lady in my building yesterday. I was telling her how I think Shanghai is a lot more like technologically developed. She's a Shanghainese lady. She's like 70, and she was like, "Oh, really? You think it's more developed than Europe?" And I was like, "Yeah, like we have all this like technology and stuff." And she's like, "So what do you use if you don't use WeChat?" And I told her we use bank cards. She was like,
Little
"What?"
little bits of plastic with
Yeah, with a
a
chip.
magnetized strip. Yeah.
Which like I don't. I mean, I'm not saying that's worse. I'm just saying I think this is more convenient, and it is the
Hmm.
whole ecosystem, right? Like Alipay, Ant Group, not Ant Financial anymore, um, and Alibaba with Taobao, so like Chinese Amazon. And then there's like a host of other apps that I don't really use.
Hmm.
You just and or WeChat. Like on WeChat, I can pay for things. I can talk to people. I can book appointments for my hospital. I can order KFC. Um, there's like WeChat mini stores. I can read the news. It's a publishing platform. A lot of like small bloggers just publish on WeChat.
Yeah.
I can do so many things on this one app. And yeah, it's very, very convenient.
And is there a kind of like limit to that? So I mean, no, here as well. Okay, speaking of Europe, we're slowly kind of starting to catch on. Recently it's with integration with these things. So you use the Uber Eats app on your phone, and you can use Apple Pay or Android Pay if you have it set up. And now contactless payments is more of a thing. And is in China, have you yet found the limit of where this technology can run, or is it really just to the question of you can use it for anything?
Um, so there's some, market forces. So, for example, like streaming,
Hmm.
there's a lot of different streaming platforms. And I don't think that if, Alibaba made its own streaming platform, it would be successful. Now, Tencent actually just bought some streaming platforms. So also like Tencent and Alibaba have stakes in a lot of companies. Also, most of the
Hmm.
Western gaming companies, by the way, like
Yeah, I
Epic
think
Games.
I think it was yeah, Supercell as well. I think I saw, which is huge for mobile games. That's Tencent own a pretty big stake in that.
Oh, Tencent has stakes in like not every, obviously not Sony, or Nintendo, but a lot of like the publishers, a lot like Epic and Riot, they both have, I
Hmm.
think like 30 or 40% stake, but don't quote me on that. Um, so there's market forces, then there's regulatory things. So like with fintech, um, Ant Group and WeChat Bank, they also have kind of lending services, but
Hmm.
or investment advice, but this is not the way your bank would be able to do it. And I think I actually don't know. Maybe you can tell me like what fintech operators can do in Europe. But so like with investment, they cannot they cannot like advise you on which funds to buy exactly. They can give you data, but they can advise you, but they can't like sell it to you.
Hmm.
That makes sense. They have
Yeah.
limits. I don't want to get into like the technical licensing stuff.
Well, when I see things that people term fintech in the West, it's generally I here it's kind of used almost as a synonym to online only. It's not
Hmm.
so much the technology and services; it's more the fact that they don't have brick and mortar branches that you go into. It's all just done via a website, via an app, and that's kind of where fintech,
Mm.
in quotation marks, is at the moment in Europe. And I think it's fascinating to compare, just how big that kind of development lag is, or that kind of integration lag is a better word perhaps, between Europe and China, where here it's still very much it's almost a niche hobbyist thing. If you ask how many people have an account with N26, let's say the kind of fintech bank based out in Germany, compared to a conventional bank like ING or ABN, the difference is going to be vast. The difference is going to be absolutely huge in terms of the number of customers. So it's the fact that it's reached that mainstream level in China, I think, and is that also a lot to do with the public's understanding of technology, or is it the usability of these tools? And is there an element of that as well that has driven how quickly this has spread?
Um, so I don't know. I think a lot of it is like banks in China are bad. I used to bank with I'm not going to say its name, but it includes Hong Kong and Shanghai in the UK. And
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't know what you'd abbreviate that to. Yeah.
but, like they were, obviously it's a bank, it's going to give me some hassle. My bank here in China, I went to change my address. It took me
Mm,
like an hour and a half. And it's not because I like the person was speaking English, by the way. I want to clarify this.
yeah.
Um, and they gave me, I think, like 15 different sheets of paper. So they are very like, and they have all these like little procedures, and
Hmm.
so I think the banking sector is really antiquated here. Although to be fair, I don't use all of their apps and things because I find them hard to use. Um, so why do people like fintech so much? I think it has to do with like people are more willing to accept technology. Even like old people in China, they all use
Mm.
WeChat and Alipay. I've met one person that didn't have a smartphone, although that might be because of where I travel. But I met a farmer and he had a sat phone because he didn't have reception where he lived.
Oh, so
Um,
it's not the question that he didn't want one. It's more that he couldn't really use one if he had one.
yeah, he could, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm sure there's a lot of people like that in China, but there are
Mm,
also like there's really cheap phones here that are really decent, like Oppo and Vivo phones,
hmm.
which are or like those are like the other two. There's like Xiaomi and Huawei, and then there's
I see those in India a lot as well because India also has a similar thing where, within the past 5 years, the kind of smartphone revolution has completely, exploded onto the scene. Everyone has a smartphone now, and everyone's on 4G. I imagine 5G soon when that rolls out there as well. And probably because they aren't caught in the West as you are between, oh, do you have an iPhone or do you have a Samsung? It's more, well, here's 20 different smaller brands that you can choose from who are all competing to push the price lower and lower.
yeah, exactly. And also here, by the way, we have really good connectivity in gen. Like I have full 4 bars 4G, and I haven't tried their 5G, but I'm pretty sure I would have pretty good 5G as well
Mhm.
if I invested in that. I have that in the metro, in the train as it's moving.
Yeah. I'm on overground trains in the Netherlands, and there's dead spots for signal here. So it's a very small country too. Let's be honest. I think the Netherlands is probably one city in China. So it's
Yeah, yeah. It's probably really bad for me though. I don't know. I don't know if I believe in are phones bad for you? I don't know.
it depends who you ask. Well, speaking of people that might generally say phones are bad, what you mentioned just then in terms of even all the older population in China being more open to tech or tech savvy. It's interesting because the last podcast that we did, we were speaking to the guys at Borderless Access who were doing this research into digitizing healthcare and digitizing, how you speak to doctors and how you arrange these appointments. And one of the things that they mentioned is that obviously uptake is lower at, places where you have an older population or in places where people are more set in their ways in terms of how to do things. And funnily enough, their research pointed to most of those places being in the West. So countries such as Indonesia and India and Nigeria, you're looking at Africa and the East, they were much more likely to take on these digital solutions than people based in Germany or in the USA who were very reluctant uh, to do things. And I'm curious to get your take because, they gave me the perspective from Germany and India. From the view in China, why is that, people are much more inclined to take up these tech-driven solutions? And I think one of the factors they mentioned was obviously the privacy angle, which in the EU is obviously a huge conversation. Is it as much of a public conversation in China? Are people as kind of open to discuss or question, what's happening with their personal data?
Not so much, but then again, the EU is, definitely I would say at the top of the conversation, right? And people are really talking about it a lot. Um, I mean, in China, like public conversation is different, and like what you would talk about with
Mm.
your friends is a little different. But there's definitely like there is like scholars, professors who write about this, are actively like pushing for privacy protection and so on and so forth. I mean, the best and the worst thing about the technology in China is that it is a trance, and
Hmm.
you know that sort of dystopian model of everyone is on their phone and they're just looking at videos and have no idea what's going on around them.
Yeah.
I mean, Alibaba has made it happen here. Um, of course, like at the same, whenever, like yesterday, actually, I watched my first live stream with the Lipstick King. We're gonna make a video about it. Um, the Lipstick King is a guy who makes $1 million a month, probably more, selling
Wow.
cosmetics on Taobao, where it's like a 7 hour long live stream where he just yells and you have to buy things. And they were at some point there were 170 million people, no, 100, definitely 150 million people watching this.
Wow.
And
Okay, so
I just wanted,
double the population of the United Kingdom on one live stream.
yeah, just this guy, like, um, and I wanted to get some hand cream, and surprise, surprise, I didn't. Um, but it is very good. And I think like TikTok has been a really good example of that. Like there's
Yeah.
a lot of, in China we call it Douyin. There's a few platforms like that. And they are very addictive. I mean, I don't really. There's another one that I like more because it has more like rural content, and I really like
Mhm.
watching people like cook food in the countryside and things like that. Um, but TikTok itself, I don't really, I don't have it, and I don't really follow it, other than obviously like the political perspective.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, it's just too good. Um, for our own good. And like like even the Taobao homepage, I have a hard time not being on Taobao a lot. It's also because obviously like a lot like Twitter and Instagram and my other drugs I have to use VPN for.
So that kind of gets in the way of the quick hit convenience of it.
Yeah, yeah. So it's for me it's WeChat, LinkedIn. I scroll LinkedIn a lot because it's not banned. Um, and Taobao. I'm on Taobao a lot. I'm on Taobao way more than I should be. But I find it so fascinating. Like, yeah, sorry, go on.
No, TikTok is a really interesting example you brought up because obviously TikTok's has been huge in the discussion over in the West as well. You have the whole debacle with the US. But funnily enough, a couple of weeks ago, I did a podcast with Graham Staplehurst from Kantar Brand Z. So we do kind of trust evaluations of brands across the world. And TikTok was a brand new entry into the top 100 in its first year of being operational. Yeah, it's straight into number 75. TikTok just jumped in there. Right at the top of the list, you have global companies like Amazon and Alibaba and Apple, and TikTok out of nowhere, came into this list mainly because the reasons that you're mentioning, because it has that kind of compulsive use, that kind of addictiveness to it, that feeling that all of your peers are on there, so you want to be on there as well. And it really bypassed this whole privacy conversation because it was people like, well, it's fun and I want to use it. So it's who cares about the rest in a way. And do you see, is that perhaps a common thread with some of these apps that you're seeing and that you're using, personally?
Yeah. They're like again, we have like, other than the platforms, also like there's like mini TikToks on Taobao, on like JD. All the e-commerce apps have this scrolling short video thing,
Mm.
which Instagram also tried to do, by the
Unsuccessfully, I
way,
think, let's say.
unsuccessfully. Yeah. Um, didn't go very well. But I mean, TikTok and ByteDance is a very interesting company because of the way they approach things.
Mm.
Like Toutiao, which is their previous app where they were just sharing news. They basically use the same idea over how to approach the algorithm, which is because the Facebooks, right, and the Twitters, Twitter I think is trying to move away from this, but Facebook definitely does this. It's it's a social network first,
Mm.
right? So then it serves you content based on what your friends like. And of course it measures your interaction with things as well. But your newsfeed is dominated by like it's called the social graph. And I don't want to say too much about this because I'm not an expert, but it's it's a social approach to what it shows you on the feed. Whereas Toutiao and TikTok, right? You open the app, you don't need to add anyone. It just starts showing you things.
Yeah.
And it's interesting from an interface perspective as well, right? Because Facebook has like 3 things going on, right? It has 3 sort of columns of interaction. One of them is the newsfeed. One of them, anyway. And but what TikTok does is it covers your whole screen with a video, and then it just starts showing you things, and it measures everything you're doing.
Yeah,
and
how
it's
long
just
you
it
stay
makes
on each
it
thing, or
yeah. And it makes it makes it easy for the algorithm to know what you're looking at, because you're looking at this video. So if you scroll in 1 second, it knows that this video doesn't interest you. Whereas Facebook, the algorithm won't know if you stayed on this particular part of the page because you were looking at like the news feed versus like an ad on the side versus the chat with your friend, right? So the TikTok is designed, and I think Toutiao to an extent, for the algorithm to see very well what you want to do.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's like a more efficient version of tracking your attention, or like, I guess the issue with Facebook that's been cropping up here a lot recently, especially in light of the kind of QAnon, the conspiracy side of things, is how there's that rabbit hole of content, right? It's kind of you look at one thing and then Facebook suddenly thinks, oh, he really enjoys this. Let's shovel 10 more of those things that way, and more extreme and more attention grabbing. And that's how these kind of theories spread, and that's how you end up in these situations. And it's how Facebook eventually comes under so much scrutiny for its role in this. And it seems the solution that's kind of come forward in China is to almost eliminate that aspect completely.
Yeah, I mean, and I think also TikTok does more experimentation, so it avoids these pigeonholes, right? Because what YouTube does is, first of all, it allows for way longer content, which allows for more insane people to talk for longer. And secondly, like it keeps showing you the same thing again and again. Like I have not subscribed to any new channels on my YouTube for like 2 years, and I keep seeing the same stuff, the same channels, the same. Whereas I think TikTok experiments more because it wants to keep you hooked and it wants to keep you interested, so it avoids these loops. Also, it's very interesting. There's a really good book that I recommend for, and probably anyone who's interested in this already knows this, Kai-Fu Lee's book it's called AI Superpowers. I don't know, it's really good.
Yeah, I've come across it. Yeah.
So Kai-Fu Lee was the guy who brought like Microsoft to China. He's a really important guy in Chinese technology. And he talks a lot about the birth of a lot of these apps. And one of the things that it talks about, like the interface a lot, and the user, the UI and the UX. And it talks about how like the apps in China are designed more for Chinese people, basically, because I think it has to do with how they read, and the sort of logographic system of language that they use. And so when they started designing these apps, they noticed, for example, that Chinese people will scan the whole page of the results before they click on one, and that their eye movements, they put eye trackers on people as they were interfacing with phones. Their eye movements were all over the place. And that's why now, like the Amazon gives you a list, whereas Taobao, it gives you like little bits and bobs, right? Or also like Chinese people, this is one of the reasons why Google couldn't really work in China, because Google, when you click on something, it doesn't change, it just goes into that page, right? But Chinese people, they want to, as Kai-Fu Lee says, shop for information. So what Baidu did is, when you click on one of the results, it opens it in a new tab, so then you can very easily go back to the first one and compare between lots of them.
It's little differences, right? Kind of little things that you wouldn't think about on a surface level, but then it makes a lot of sense when now that we've come to that point where there's conversations, mainstream conversations being had in the West about how companies such as, whether it's Google or Facebook or Apple or Amazon have all been using these tricks to manipulate our behavior, or using these tricks to manipulate, consumer psychology. And you realize how small a change can suddenly completely flip the way someone interacts with your service.
Yeah, and I think the best thing would be to use this to do good things. But of course, no one really wants to design an app that you naturally interact with 15 minutes and then it reinvigorates your passion for life, and then you turn off your phone and you go hiking, right? Like, no one wants to do that.
Like the final app. Yeah.
But there is, I mean, I think there is a lot of potential in technology, and I would really like this kind of design thinking to be implemented on other things, but I don't make these systems, so.
Well, I'm curious to also see. So you speak about these big tech firms, especially the ones that are based out in the West, and recently you probably seen on the news they were all dragged in front of the U.S. Senate for these hearings on if it's time to break up monopolies, and the regulatory kind of net is starting to draw closer. In the West especially, and it feels a lot of punitive measures being taken against these companies, but not so much to kind of regulate future behavior and encourage that innovation. So I'm interested to know, from your perspective in China, what is it that the government's doing there in the kind of regulatory space to not just constrain companies, but actually push that innovation as well? Like, is there anything that they're doing differently in China compared to the way it's been handled here?
So, I mean, it's different because in China, there is a lot more protectionism, right? And internal competition. So one of the big things that they do is they shut off China from the rest of the world, and they allow their own companies to develop, like, data localization, right? So data is more available to Chinese companies as opposed to other companies. But I think this goes back to our original discussion, and it's that China is not just about regulation, and Chinese regulation for a lot of things is really strict, but the government does other things as well. It's also kind of like a private enterprise as well, so it can back certain companies, right, as opposed to others, and it can conduct all of these experiments. So I think their model is regulate on one side but experiment on the other side, and do support some companies.
So I feel I mean, what's your take on this? From obviously within the tech context, you do a lot more kind of research and looking into this. And is that what's lacking in Europe and the US to try and close that gap? Is it more, we're so fixated here at the moment on kind of punishing the companies that do something wrong, as opposed to encouraging that next generation to innovate and kind of look beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very concerned about Europe, to be honest, because I don't understand why there's not more innovation coming out of Europe. And I think perhaps it is this it's a lot of things, but I think one of those things is definitely that the government is either like they have no clue what's going on. Say GDPR, say I think IT security is a really interesting thing to look at, because there was like no laws coming out of the EU for so long, and that's why, like, for telecommunications, you have just so many different like systems around Europe, and there's like no homogeneity, and then they were like, oh my God, we got to do something about this, because a certain other government started hating on a certain company, right? And so I think in Europe and the US, like, the governments are really asleep at the wheel for a lot of things. And that is because, they're very busy with some other things. Like in Europe, we were talking about immigration for the longest time.
Yeah.
And then, in the meantime, we realized that China had like bought a bunch of important things in Europe. And then we were like, oh, what are we going to do about this? you know?
Funnily enough, the immigration conversation is happening again in Europe with the context of technology. And interestingly enough, one of the grounds that they're putting in for more monitoring is also epidemic prevention, which kind of leads me on to, I think, obviously the elephant in the year 2020, which is the kind of COVID pandemic. China is obviously at a very different stage with this compared to Europe. And I'm curious, what role do you think technology has played in getting China to that point? Because in Europe, we've had a lot of controversies here in the Netherlands, or whether it's in the UK, in terms of test and trace apps, and a lot of money poured into them for not very much in return. Did technology provide the tools for China to really overcome this quicker than a lot of countries in the West are managing?
Yes. That's the short answer. So, so I did a lot of research on this, and I actually did research on what Europe was doing as well vis-a-vis China. So in China, at some point in I think February, the central government, I don't know, they called Alibaba. They probably have a direct line, and WeChat, and they said, "Hey, we want you to make contact tracing apps." And I think they made it, and they made the prototype in 2 days, and it was fully operational in 2 weeks.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
imagine, a lot of people didn't sleep for that to happen, and I thank them profoundly. And so now we have a system, and of course this is also accompanied by a general state capacity. So the way I see it is now China has like an on and off switch. So they've built a lot of testing capacity, and that does have to do with tech. There were like car companies started manufacturing PPE, like BAM. There was like BYD, which is I think the biggest car manufacturer, and they like in a week they made the biggest mask factory in the world. They just switched their whole production to that.
And the hospital as well, I think, was one of the early kind of examples that we saw, over in Europe. It's 1 week to build this kind of huge new hospital net.
Yeah, the 10-day hospital thing. And they were also streaming it live, which was a message. But so there were a lot of those things. The lockdowns were intense because this is not tech related, but the party has a lot of people like on staff that they can mobilize very quickly. So every apartment building. So I live in a building which is part of 3 buildings, and say maybe like 5,000 people live in these 3 buildings because they're 25 floors each and blah blah blah. And so we have a party representative in our building who's responsible for. He's our community representative. Let's say that's what it's called. And usually they'll take care of like the wall, like painting, and I don't know if you want to change the locks and things like that. And then all those people were mobilized to make sure that they were monitoring like who's coming in and out of the buildings, right? So very quick mobilization of a lot of people, like probably millions of people were involved in making sure that the lockdowns were happening. And with all of that came this QR code system that we have, it was quite fragmented, and there were different like universities that had their own systems, but there is a unified system, at least from a user perspective, where you go on your WeChat or your Alipay and you pick the city that you want to be in, and you put your information in, like your ID number and whether you've had any symptoms, and then that somehow presumably checks where you've been in the last 14 days, and it gives you green, yellow, red codes. And then you need to show that if you want to enter various buildings. Now, this was enforced a lot in March, and then they stopped enforcing it. And then, like in Beijing, when they had the Xinfadi, the new outbreak, they just told all those people, all those like community party people, they were like, okay, you got to start checking for codes again. So they put up the sort of blocks again at the building, and then everyone was checking for codes. Then they test everyone, they find the cases, then this disappears. So they've just created this switch that they can turn on and off. So right now life is very normal.
I envy you in that position, I suppose. It's kind of, one of the things that we've talked about a couple of times on this podcast in the past with, especially some of our colleagues who are based in Amsterdam. So Tom van Almen and Zeno Konings in particular, who do a lot of work at the Living Labs in Amsterdam, looking at things like AI, crowd monitoring, things that we would consider future tech. AI is, I think, a pretty big area that we haven't touched on yet in this discussion. I mean, speaking a lot about the present use of this technology and already how it seems to be a couple of years removed from Europe. What do you see in the future in China? How do you see the use of tech, the proliferation of tech, things such as artificial intelligence developing from this point onwards?
So China is already a very digitalized country, and I think it will be more digitalized. And all these apps are very important in producing data about your habits and what you want and what you don't want. Now AI, like my problem with AI is that everything is AI and nothing is AI.
Yeah.
I don't think, I don't think China has like some super wow advantage. Actually, by some measures, it's still behind the US. They are using it in a lot of things. I think their next big goal is smart manufacturing and IoT, and combining that with e-commerce technologies, and so you can also ship things abroad and things like that. I think perhaps with COVID as well, cleaning up agricultural practices will also be a big issue, and IoT and AI have a big role to play there. I'm sure you read about the pigs that were face scanned for, I'm not sure why they were doing that, but it got a lot of publicity.
If you can, why not, right? Like
yeah, I guess. I mean, you can face scan anything. So yeah, I think that's something China really needs to do. And then I'm really excited to see what comes out with these 5-year plans, because I think that will be a big, big, big thing. And I really hope that we see a lot of things being used for sustainable purposes. And I think, by the way, that this is like one of the unspoken tragedies of the current US-China problems, because China is the largest producer of like solar panels in the world, right? And it's one of the world's leading investors in renewable energies. Not that it's a totally like clean energy country or anything, but because of its size and because they've invested a lot of this, they are a very important cog in the supply chain.
Yeah.
And so far, like we haven't seen any problems, but and I hope we don't, but it's possible that we will.
And what do you see in terms of when you spoke clean energy? Then I was also thinking of things like one of the big solar panel players now in the US is arguably Tesla, who started off as this car company, and Europe is also making a lot of strides towards, through regulation, phasing out things like diesel cars, pushing electrification. How do you see that movement progressing in China as well? Are we seeing, the kind of car culture is on the decline? Are people looking for electric, looking for sustainable means of transport?
So yeah, definitely. So the car industry in China is very big and very important, and there are a lot of players. Some of them allegedly copy Tesla. Definitely a lot of Tesla fans. Tesla is building its new gigafactory here in Shanghai. But the government was really giving a lot of subsidies, and there are a lot of electric cars in China, more than you would expect, at least in big cities, not so much in smaller. But really, there are like the average like Uber that I will get into is probably electric, and I know because I can hear it.
Not hear it, rather, right?
Yeah, not hear it. Yeah. But I think like don't quote me on that, but I think the total is like 25%. No, 25% of all new energy vehicles, I think, are hydrogen powered. I don't know what the percentage of the total is, but there are a lot. But the government was giving out a lot of subsidies for a very long time for electric vehicles. And China really does have a car culture, like America type situation going on, because it's very big. Obviously not in like Shanghai. But then when they tried this summer or spring to reduce some of the subsidies, the market really slowed, presumably also because of COVID, and so they reintroduced them. So I think from my like very outsider's perspective, because I don't really report on this, and I don't drive here. I think that that's like the big question still, like can the industry survive without government support? And there was also the case of NEO, which is perhaps the most famous company, which had to be bailed out because they almost went bankrupt. And they were bailed out by a local government. I want to say like Henan province, but I'm probably wrong.
And they're the ones that build the insanely fast electric car, right? The kind of...
Yeah, presumably.
Yeah.
Presumably.
It's a familiar name. Yeah.
NEO.
Wow, I think... Yeah, I'm just thinking, comparing the futures of Europe vis-a-vis technology and China with regards to technology, it feels like having two completely different conversations. And, as someone who's, I guess, up until recently traveled between the two, I guess my last question to you would be, what do you think it will take to get, Europe in particular on that same playing field or on that same kind of level as China? Do you think there's a chance for us to kind of make up that gap? And what would it take?
What would it take? It would take a really big restructuring of how people think, both like just your average person and governments. I don't know if it's really possible, to be honest with you. Not to say there are, very talented engineers and very smart policymakers in Europe. I just don't know if they can do what China does. Because China, like if you want to, like China is doing a whole thing. It's not just a tech thing. It's a legal thing, and it's an economic thing, and it's creating a system where like engineers are super valued, and creating a system where like what Chinese kids go through like to go to university is just absolutely insane. They go to school from like 6 a.m. till like 10 p.m. for 2 years. So it's an entire system that has created this, and I don't think Europe can do this whole thing. I would flip the question and say that like the tech industries that each region has are proportional to their values. And so for me, like living in China, as excited I am, it doesn't necessarily like, and I'm very impressed on a daily basis, but it doesn't necessarily match with my like European preferences. I think like in China, there's like no unemployment benefits, basically. Right. So that means you gotta have a job. So could you really do that in Europe to push people to go to work? And do you really want to do that in Europe?
Yeah, I guess as you mentioned, then like does that kind of align with those ideals or those values that Europe has? Yeah.
I mean, I love Europe. I think like what's interesting is in Europe, like there is innovation. It's just more like niche, small, but there are like really important companies in Europe. A lot of car companies in Germany. There's like Imagination Technologies, which is like a semiconductor company in the UK. There are important companies. Perhaps Europe is better for like social innovation.
That's a very diplomatic answer.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to sound too pessimistic. I'm sorry.
No, it's really interesting to get your perspective. Obviously, someone who's grown up in Europe and is now in China, and the perspective I think that we don't get to hear too much in the West. As I said at the kind of in the little introduction, a lot of our media coverage or discussion around China is very negative. It's very focused on the negatives, and it's been really interesting to get your point of view on this and get that real boots on the ground view of what life is really like. So yeah, big thanks, Eliza, for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much, Shriek. Thanks for having me. And yeah, Thanks everyone for listening. And if you have any questions or if there's anything you would like us to investigate, you can reach out to me on Twitter at egreech, EGREECHEE, or go on technode.com and you can read a lot of articles about China. We cover AI, we cover electric vehicles, cybersecurity, we cover e-commerce quite a lot. So, and of course, I do blockchain and fintech. So yeah, you can pretty much find a dish for every appetite you may have when it comes to China tech on technode.com. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the episode description as well. Yeah, I think there's plenty more to talk about, so I'd love to have you back on sometime as well to do a bit of a follow-up.
Yeah, sure. Maybe next time we can pick a more focused topic, because I think we're rambling a lot.
I think that's what our listeners come back for.
Okay, rambling. I'm good. I'm good at that.
We'll focus group that one.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Shriek.
And to all of our listeners, I do hope you enjoyed the rambling discussion. I hope you learned something new as a result, and I do hope we've left you with some food for thought. A big thanks once again to Eliza for taking the time. And of course, yeah, in the meantime, if you have any future ideas, you have questions to Eliza that we can share the next time we have her on, do feel free to send them across to podcast@esomar.org. And you can now, of course, follow us on your podcast platform of choice. We are on Spotify, iTunes, TuneIn, many, many more. So whichever one takes your fancy. Yeah, please do stay safe, stay healthy, stay curious, and I do hope you'll join us again next time.